its existence is a necessary condition. The necessity by which, if the good in question is to exist, the means to it must exist, is merely a natural or causal necessity. If the laws of nature were different, exactly the same good might exist, although what is now a necessary condition of its existence did not exist. The existence of the means has no intrinsic value, and its utter annihilation would leave the value of that which it is now necessary to secure entirely unchanged. But in the case of a part of such a whole as we are now considering, it is otherwise. In this case the good in question cannot conceivably exist, unless the part exist also. The necessity which connects the two is quite independent of natural law. What is asserted to have intrinsic value is the existence of the whole, and the existence of the whole includes the existence of its part. Suppose the part removed, and what remains is not what was asserted to have intrinsic value. But if we suppose a means removed, what remains is just what was asserted to have intrinsic value. And yet, too, the existence of the part may itself have no more intrinsic value than that of the means. It is this fact which constitutes the paradox of the relation which we are discussing. It has just been said that what has intrinsic value is the existence of the whole, and that this includes the existence of the part, and from this it would seem a natural inference that the existence of the part has intrinsic value. But the inference would be as false as if we were to conclude that, because the number of 2 stones was 2, each of the stones was also 2. The part of a valuable whole retains exactly the same value when it is, as when it is not, a part of that whole. If it had value under other circumstances, its value is not any greater when it is part of a far more valuable whole, and if it had no value by itself, it has none still, however great be that of the whole of which it now forms a part. We are not then justified in asserting that one and the same thing is under some circumstances intrinsically good, and under others not so, as we are justified in asserting of a means that it sometimes does and sometimes does not produce good results. And yet we are justified in asserting that it is far more desirable that a certain thing should exist under some circumstances than under others, namely when other things will exist in such relations to it as to form a more valuable whole. It will not have more intrinsic value under those circumstances than under others. It will not necessarily even be a means to the existence of things having more intrinsic value, but it will, like a means, be a necessary condition for the existence of that which has greater intrinsic value, although, unlike a means, it will itself form a part of the more valuable existent. 20. I have said that the peculiar relation between part and whole which I have just been trying to define is one which has received no separate name. It would, however, be useful that it should have one, and there is a name which might be well appropriated to it, if only it could be divorced from its present unfortunate usage. Philosophers, especially those who profess to have derived great benefit from the writings of Hegel, have latterly made much use of the terms organic whole, organic unity, organic relation. The reason why these terms might well be appropriated to the use suggested is that the peculiar relation of parts to whole, just defined, is one of the properties which distinguishes the wholes to which they are actually applied with the greatest frequency. And the reason why it is desirable that they should be divorced from their present usage is that, as at present used, they have no distinct sense, and on the contrary both imply and propagate errors of confusion. To say that a thing is an organic whole is generally understood to imply that its parts are related to one another and to itself as means to end. It is also understood to imply that they have a property described in some such phrase as they have no meaning or significance apart from the whole. And finally such a whole is also treated as if it had the property to which I am proposing that the name should be confined. But those who use the term give us, in general, no hint as to how they suppose these three properties to be related to one another. it seems generally to be assumed that they are identical, and always at least that they are necessarily connected with one another. That they are not identical I have already tried to shew. To suppose them so is to neglect the very distinctions pointed out in the last paragraph, and the usage might well be discontinued merely because it encourages such neglect. But a still more cogent reason for its discontinuance is that, so far from being necessarily connected, the second is a property which can attach to nothing, being a self-contradictory conception, whereas the first, if we insist on its most important sense, applies to many cases to which we have no reason to think that the third applies also, and the third certainly applies to many to which the first does not apply. 21. These relations between the three properties just distinguished may be illustrated by references to a whole of the kind from which the name organic was derived, a whole which is an organism in the scientific sense, namely, the human body. 1. There exists between many parts of our body, though not between all, a relation which has been familiarized by the fable attributed to Menenius Agrippa concerning the belly and its members. We can find it in parts such that the continued existence of one is a necessary condition for the continued existence of the other, while the continued existence of this latter is also a necessary condition for the continued existence of the former. This amounts to no more than saying that in the body we have instances of two things, both enduring for some time, which have a relation of mutual causal dependence on one another, a relation of reciprocity. Frequently no more than this is meant by saying that the parts of the body form an organic unity, or that they are mutually means and ends to one another. And we certainly have here a striking characteristic of living things, but it would be extremely rash to assert that this relation of mutual causal dependence was only exhibited by living things and hence was sufficient to define their peculiarity. And it is obvious that of two things which have these relations of mutual dependence neither may have intrinsic value, or one may have it and the other lack it. They are not necessarily ends to one another in any sense except that in which end means effect. And moreover it is plain that in this case the whole cannot be an end to any of its parts. We are apt to talk of the whole in contrast to one of its parts, when in fact we mean only the rest of the parts. But strictly the whole must include all its part, and no part can be a cause of the whole, because it cannot be a cause of itself. It is plain, therefore, that this relation of mutual causal dependence implies nothing with regard to the value of either of the objects which have it, and that, even if both of them happen also to have value, this relation between them is one which cannot hold between part and whole. But 2. It may also be the case that our body as a whole has a value greater than the sum of values of its parts, and this may be what is meant when it is said that the parts are means to the whole. It is obvious that if we ask the question, why should the parts be such as they are, a proper answer may be, because the whole they form has so much value. But it is equally obvious that the relation which we thus assert to exist between part and whole is quite different from that which we assert to exist between part and part, when we say, this part exists, because that one could not exist without it. In the latter case we assert the two parts to be causally connected, but in the former, part and whole cannot be causally connected, and the relation which we assert to exist between them may exist even though the parts are not causally connected either. All the parts of a picture do not have that relation of mutual causal dependence which certain parts of the body have, and yet the existence of those which do not have it may be absolutely essential to the value of the whole. The two relations are quite distinct in kind, and we cannot infer the existence of the one from that of the other. It can, therefore, serve no useful purpose to include them both under the same name. And if we are to say that a whole is organic because its parts are in this sense means to the whole, we must not say that it is organic because its parts are causally dependent on one another. 22. But finally, 3. The sense which has been prominent in recent uses of the term organic whole is one whereby it asserts the parts of such a whole have a property which the parts of no whole can possibly have. It is supposed that just as the whole would not be what it is but for the existence of the parts, so the parts would not be what they are but for the existence of the whole. And this is understood to mean not merely that any particular part could not exist unless the others existed too, which is the case where relation 1 exists between the parts, but actually that the part is no distinct object of thought, that the whole of which it is a part is in turn a part of it. That this supposition is self-contradictory, a very little reflection should be sufficient to shew. We may admit, indeed, that when a particular thing is part of a whole, it does possess a predicate which it would not otherwise possess, namely that it is a part of the whole. But what cannot be admitted is that this predicate alters the nature or enters into the definition of the thing which has it. When we think of the part itself, we mean just that which we assert, in this case, to have the predicate that it is part of the whole. And the mere assertion that it is a part of the whole involves that it should itself be distinct from that which we assert of it. Otherwise we contradict ourselves, since we assert that not it, but something else, namely it together with that which we assert of it, has the predicate which we assert of it. In short, it is obvious that no part contains analytically the whole to which it belongs, or any other parts of that whole. The relation of part to whole is not the same as that of whole to part, and the very definition of the latter is that it does not contain analytically that which it is said to be its part. And yet this very self-contradictory doctrine is the chief mark which shews the influence of Hegel upon modern philosophy, an influence which pervades almost the whole of orthodox philosophy. This is what is generally implied by the cry against falsification by abstraction, that a whole is always a part of its part. If you want to know the truth about a part, we are told, you must consider not that part, but something else, namely the whole. Nothing is true of the part, but only of the whole. Yet plainly it must be true of the part at least that it is part of the whole, and it is obvious that when we say it is, we do not mean merely that the whole is a part of itself. This doctrine, therefore, that a part can have no meaning or significance apart from its whole, must be utterly rejected. It implies itself that the statement "this is a part of that whole" has a meaning, and in order that this may have one, both subject and predicate must have a distinct meaning. And it is easy to see how this false doctrine has arisen by confusion with the relations 1 and 2, which may really be properties of wholes. A. The existence of a part may be connected by a natural or causal necessity with the existence of other parts of its whole. And further, what is a part of a whole and what has been seized to be such a part, although differing intrinsically from one another, may be called by one and the same name. Thus, to take a typical example, if an arm be cut off from the human body, we still call it an arm. Yet an arm, when it is part of the body, undoubtedly differs from a dead arm, and hence we may easily be led to say, the arm which is a part of the body would not be what it is if it were not such a part, and to think that the contradiction thus expressed is in reality a characteristic of things. But, in fact, the dead arm never was part of the body. It is only partially identical with the living arm. Those parts of it which are identical with parts of the living arm are exactly the same, whether they belong to the body or not. And in them we have an undeniable instance of one and the same thing at one time forming a part and at another not forming a part of the presumed organic whole. On the other hand, those properties which are possessed by the living and not by the dead arm do not exist in a change form in the latter. They simply do not exist there at all. By a causal necessity their existence depends on their having that